In this video, I'll show you guys how to sign a JV agreement along with a along with a seller finance agreement and a subject to agreement. So as far as JV agreement, um, keep it pretty short. I mean, it's straightforward, right? Just put in the date. It was going to be put in the date that it's supposed to be signed, property address, the parties, just allocation of expense. If you guys are, putting money into the deal, say how much you're putting in, and what percent from each parties, and then profit. Obviously, if it's a 50-50, you put there 60-40, vice versa, whatever the case may be. And then along with additional terms and conditions, right? These are just things that aren't within the contract, saying that, hey, look, let's say for an example, buyer submitted 5K in EMD, and that EMD will go to party A. You just put that into additional terms and conditions, or whatever the case may be. Some of these stuff are pretty straightforward. Again, I'll implore all you guys to look this over, read it, understand it. Make sure you guys, like I said again, make sure you guys are understanding what you're sending out, and not just sending out anything because I'm telling you that to send it out, right? You want to make sure you understand what you're sending out. But yeah, for the most part, this is pretty simple and straightforward. So we'll move over to seller finance, right? If you guys don't know what seller finance is, it's pretty much, getting a property, and just, work typically for sellers that have or that want high prices, for their homes. You give them an option to seller finance, essentially just being the bank, and taking payments on the home. It works really, really great when the terms are favorable, and the location is great, but sometimes it doesn't work that great when even if the terms are great and the location is not there, then probably will end up not selling. But yeah, I give another master class on that, show you guys how to find these deals and how to essentially structure the deals so they're favorable and you get them sold every time. So with this here, it's pretty straightforward, simple, right? Again, it's just property address. Majority of stuff is already filled out for you, so you essentially don't have to do anything. In this video, I'll kind of just walk through, show you guys what you have to do, and then again, like I said, I always implore you guys to read it, understand it, because 9 times out of 10, you want to make sure you're able to explain it over to the seller if need be. So again, like I said, property address goes here, purchase price. So if it's a seller finance deal, you ever put whatever the purchase price is, right? So if you're buying the home for $800,000, you'll put $800,000. And I always want to put an approximate, not exact, because you want to make sure the title company is able to decide that, not you, because you never know, right? But for the most part, you always want to put approximate, and then you want to put the purchase, the purchase price on there. EMD typically comes out about being $2,000. If you're selling it over to end buyer, it could be at $2,000. Typically, I like to put it at $1,000, $2,000. It really doesn't matter as long as you have a higher EMD submitted, from the buyer. This portion here, you don't necessarily have to worry about, because again, you are doing a seller finance, so you don't necessarily have to, worry about this. Matter of fact, you could actually delete this if you're sending it over to a seller, because you essentially don't need it, right? So this whole thing, including this, could be deleted. And then here would just be cash at closing, which would be essentially the down payment. So whatever is owed to the seller, would be due here. So if it's $20,000, if it's $20,000 down, you would put $20,000 down here, at the down payment, and it would be considered cash at closing. So close of escrow, all that means is when the deal is closing, right? So here you just put the date. So if it's December 31st, 2025, you put that. January 1st, whatever the case may be, you put it here. And then 9 times out of 10, you don't necessarily have to worry about these here. Closing attorney, right? This is pretty much who you're closing the deal with. Like I said, I always advocate you guys work with closed titles. It's a title company that's really, really great. And they're really fantastic, right? They close every and all deals, and they're nationwide, so it's kind of a home in, a ballpark home run, right? So you're not necessarily having to look for title companies in each state that you operate in. If you operate in multiple states, you kind of already have closed titles that's nationwide and already does it all. Parties. So it would just be seller's name, seller number, again, which, buyer's name, and then it should be your email as well. Um, so we're looking at inspection period, right? So, like I said, typically I want you guys to have an extensive, lengthy inspection period, right? You never want to put, or excuse me, you always want to put business days, right? You never want to not have business days on it, just because it eats away at your, inspection period, one, and two, 9 times out of 10, people aren't really working on weekends like that. Although you might be, majority of the buyers and inspectors or whatever the case may be aren't. So you always want to make sure business days is always on there. And typically, like I said, I want to go about 11 as the lowest to 13 and 15, 16 as the highest in terms of inspection. You don't want to have a 20-day inspection period unless the deal permits it. But 9 times out of 10, you never want to have that high of an inspection period because you don't want to waste this. You don't want to just have it tied up for a lengthy time and you can't sell it, right? I think 13, 15 days is really great. That way it gives you time. And 9 times out of 10, if the terms make sense and you're in a good area, it should sell a lot quicker than that. Here below is just closing cost, right? So this just, looking over closing costs, pretty straightforward. Just states that buyer would be covering 100% of the closing cost, and that seller won't have to pay any closing cost. If it's, vice versa and seller has to pay 50-50, make sure you check this off. If seller's paying 100%, make sure you check this off as well, and then make sure you move these to the appropriate boxes. So this here is essentially where the seller finance terms will take place at, right? So this whole portion here is where you essentially put down what payments are, for how long, and how many years they amortize over, and if they're principal, if they're interest only, or if they're both principal and interest, right? So again, I always implore you guys to read this over, right? In this case, right, if you're reading this and you get up to this portion here, pretty much be straightforward, right? All it asks are what are the monthly payments, right? So if you're saying you're paying the seller $4,000 a month, you'll say $4,000 per month for, in this case, typically they have a balloons, right? So you put 6 years of the balloon, 7 years of the balloon, right? And then the amortized over would be, what the payments are amortized over, and if it's 30 years, you put it here. 40 years, 20 years, whatever the case may be, you put it here. And again, you always want to put the payments will include taxes and insurance, because you never want to pay, you'll never want to make payments and not include those as well. And then again here, this will kind of just clarify whether you're paying principal only, interest only, or both principal and interest. If you're doing principal only, you will, as they already see, it's already X'd this, this box is already X'd. If you're doing interest only, then you'll X this box, and then vice versa. If you're doing principal and interest, you'll X this box. But yeah, we keep going a little bit lower. Again, understand why this box is X'd. This just basically states that the property is vacant. If there is a tenant in there and they're requiring a lease back, you'll just mark this. Pretty simple. So again, you look over purchase and sale agreement. Again, I can't stress this enough. Please, please, please read what you guys are signing, right? Because again, I can explain it as best as I can, but if you're not, if you don't understand it, if you don't read it for yourself, you're gonna be stuck when a seller asks you questions about it, and you can't come back to this video. It's gonna be a lot harder, right? So you always want to make sure you're understanding what you're sending out to these sellers, right? So majority of stuff is pretty straightforward, simple, just kind of going over it, just read it. Here, buyer initials required, so this is just if the home is built prior to 1978, you put it here. If it's built after 1978, you put it here. Just kind of a lead paint warning or disclosure. And you're kind of just checking this off, make sure you read it and understand it. Here, right, so I want to make sure I highlight this as well. This essentially states, this right here is what needs to be changed, right? Majority of you guys are doing deals in different states, so if you're doing them in Texas, obviously it'll be Texas. If you're doing them in Arizona, you put AZ. If you're doing them in whatever, Florida, you put Florida, right? So you want to make sure you're putting the state that you're doing the deal in on here, so you're following all state laws. And then again here, seller's initials, you only have to put it once, you don't have to put it twice. In case there is two sellers on the property, then you put it twice. In this case, if there's only one seller, then you only put it once. And again, make sure you're reading these, understanding what you're sending over to the seller. Um, make sure you understand it, right? Because they're gonna ask questions 9 times out of 10. So I want to make sure you guys are understanding it. So again, simple, right? Once it's been approved and accepted by seller, you put the date here, you put the date here, and you could typically do this through DocuSign, so you're not having to change the date. Um, and then obviously seller's signature, and then seller's name, and then vice versa, buyer signature and buyer name, right? Simple. If there's more than one seller, then you put the additional seller's name and date and whatever the case and signature as well, right? And make sure you guys are also checking off these boxes as well. So you want to make sure you put seller's initials. Again, you can do this all through DocuSign, but it gives you the option to put seller's initials. Make sure you're doing that. It has it for every single page, kind of just showing that sellers have read the page. And they understand each clause within the page, right? Simple and straightforward. So again, we'll go to subject to, right? Subject to agreements are typically the same in terms of contract terms as the seller finance agreement, with only a few changes. And I'll kind of go over those changes here. As I stated before, purchase price, right? A lot of you guys are confusing the purchase price. The purchase price for a subject to agreement is, and I want you guys to write this down, it's mortgage balance plus the down payment, right? So if your mortgage balance is 400,000 and your down payment is 20,000, then your purchase price is 420,000. Okay, because again, you're assuming, or you're essentially taking over the debt. In addition to that, you're also putting down a down payment to take over the debt, right? And if you guys don't know what subject to is, essentially is just taking over the debt on properties that have little to no equity in them, but have really attractive rates. So for purchase price, you want to make sure you're putting, it's the mortgage balance plus the down payment, which is considered the purchase price. And again, you always want to put it approximate, because you want to make sure the seller, even if you have the mortgage statements, you want to make sure the title has confirmed it with their lender. But again, EMD is straightforward, it's $2,000. Again, here you would put pretty much the existing first mortgage, right? So if the seller's existing first mortgage is 400,000, you would put 400,000, and then vice versa. If they have another mortgage, you put that there, and then if they have another one, you would just make another copy. Typically, you only want to stick to one mortgage. If they have two and the numbers make sense, then okay. But if they're going above that, then it's probably not a deal, even if you get it for little to no down. And again, here is the amount. Here, this is basically all that says is if they owe anything, right? Do they have back taxes? Are they owing anything on the property? If so, you put that here, right? So if they owe $5,000 in back taxes, then you put that there, and you also make sure you buffer that towards purchase price, because again, you're paying an additional $5,000, so it ends up being 455,000, right? So make sure you're putting that there as well, and then cash at closing will pretty much be the down payment, whatever the seller is walking away with. So if it's, you agree to the seller, $10,000, then it would be $10,000. If you agree 15, whatever the case is, right? Just like I said in the last video, the rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward, simple. It's already the same as the, seller finance agreement. Nothing really changes other than a few things up here, and then I'll show you a few other stuff down here as well. But yeah, as you can see, that agreement, that seller finance agreement, isn't here as well, because again, you don't necessarily need it, because you are doing a subject to agreement. So you just keep marking initials, make sure they're reading it and they're understanding it. And then, like I said, there is, let me see if I could find it here. This as well, you want to make sure you're putting the appropriate state that it's in, and you're not, necessarily putting the incorrect state. So in this case, if the deal's in Texas, you put Texas. If it's in Florida, you put in Florida. Another thing I want to go over with you guys is this portion here, right? Clause 13 and clause 14. This is extremely important, especially when doing subject to deals, right? This is why I implore you guys to really do your research, or ask me if you have any questions, because I can try to answer them as much as possible, right? First, I guess, myth busters, right? It's subject to agreements are the loan can never be called due, right? In that case, it's wrong, right? Regardless of how you structure it, whether you put it into a trust or X, Y, and Z, whatever the case may be, if the lender woke up tomorrow and seen that it was a subject to agreement done on it, they can call due, and there's nothing you could do about it, right? Um, Again, there are ways to make sure the loan isn't called due. And I know a lot of buyers or a lot of investors that have never had their loan called due and they've owned many subject to agreements. One being obviously, this keeping majority of stuff in the seller's name and just making payments to a third party service company. That way they can make the payments towards the respective parties, whether it's the lender, insurance, taxes, whatever the case is. But 13 and 14 just states clearly something called a deed in lieu, right? If you guys don't know what a deed in lieu is, a deed in lieu is pretty much an agreement or a promise that a buyer makes that they will continue to make payments on behalf of the seller if they were to assume this loan, right? And all that means is if the buyer was to take over the loan, as you can see, again, I'll implore all you guys to read this and understand what this is. Excuse me, and understand what this is. But all this states is that, if a buyer fails to make 2 months of consecutive payments, they will be in default, meaning that they would have to deed the property back to the seller in less than 7 days. And that's really, really important. Subject to agreements, make sure you guys have those in there, because you also, on top of, at the end of the day, I understand, you guys are in it for the money, you guys want to get rich, but at the same time, you also want to protect the sellers, right? You never want to kind of give them a crappy buyer that never intended to pay on it and just ruin their credit and have them go under foreclosure and put them in a worse situation than they were previously, right? So you want to make sure you have clauses in there that protect these sellers. In this case, this clause here, make sure it protects the seller. That way buyers make monthly payments and they're not going under pre-foreclosure with their lender, right? And if they do, if the buyer does miss payments, the property would be deeded back to the seller, and they would keep the down payment, all improvements, and reduction towards the mortgage. And then again here, this is liens. This basically just states that the buyer cannot take out additional liens or mortgages on the property, right? I've seen cases where buyers will assume, take over subject to agreements, and they understand that it's under seller's name, and sometimes they try to take out loans or, second position mortgages under seller's names, which is not right, and you guys shouldn't do it. And in this case, this kind of just states that they're not able to. 9 times out of 10, they're not really able to be honest, even if the seller's name is on the original mortgage. But this just states that they can't take out additional loans or second position mortgages that isn't authorized by the seller or under the seller's name, and seller has no idea what's going on, right? Kind of just putting them in a bigger hole. But yeah, the rest of it is pretty simple. Again, date, signature, name, and then vice versa for buyer's end. With subject to, guys, I want to make sure you guys are understanding what it is, right? Subject to is a great tool, powerful tool if done correctly. But at the same time, you also want to make sure you're vetting the buyer really, really well, and vetting the seller as well, right? And kind of showing them the expectations of what they're walking into, right? You never want to fill their heads with broken promises, tell them this, that, and the third, and then it turns out being the exact opposite, right? So subject twos are really great, but they can be dangerous if done incorrectly.